Nancy was an experienced hiker. She loved to spend as much time as she possibly could in the mountains. She'd hiked about 10 different 14ers and just in general, like, loved the experience of being out in nature and communing at the highest levels of geographic features. So she decided to go to the San Lucia Mountains in California, specifically to Big Sur. So she heads to Big Sur to hike. And as she's hiking, she's looking at the beautiful sunscapes and mountainscapes, and she's gleaming through the trees and taking in everything that she possibly can. She's listening to the sounds of birds. She's attentive, of course, as you should be when you're hiking, to any sort of possible predator in the midst of where you are. Something that's wise to do. She's taken all the precautions. She's prepared, and she's got supplies of food. She's ready for the experience. As she hikes higher and higher into the mountains, she begins to look at ridges, and something catches her eye. A dark shape cast against the side of the mountain, a ridge. First glance, it's just a shadow, but as she hikes on, she sees it again on a different ridge. This time she looks a little closer, and she sees the appearance of what looks to be a very, very tall man, dressed all in black, wearing a pointy hat and a long black robe. She shakes her head. Surely no, there's no one up there. When she looks again, of course, it's gone. She hikes on into the forest. As she goes through the dark forest, she doesn't see any ridges for a while. She's kind of surrounded by the foliage, but as she emerges again to a certain spot, she looks up and sees another ridge on the edge and notices that the sun is beginning to dwindle, to go down. And there it is again, closer this time. This ridge is maybe a quarter of a mile away. And it's clear this time, this is a man, a very tall, 10-foot tall man, standing with black cloak and black hood and black hat, looking down on her. She thinks she can see eyes, but no matter what, she knows he's watching her specifically. She begins to feel uneasy, and she tries to push it out of her mind, and she moves further on into the hike, and she hikes and she hikes and she hikes, and eventually she reaches the spot in the ridge, and there's nothing there. She looks again to another ridge, this one maybe an eighth of a mile away. He's there again, watching, waiting. She calls out, "Who are you? Why are you watching me?" Nothing. No response. It just stares. She hikes a little further on, now suddenly beginning to be very aware that she is being watched and she is being pursued. And she decides to try to turn back, but when she does, she looks back to the ridge she has just left, and there he is, 10 feet tall, blocking her path. And this time she's certain it's smiling at her. Nancy was never seen again. This is the legend of the Dark Watchers from the San Lucia Mountains in California. My name is Chad Lehrman, and I will be your host today for Urban Legends Unmasked as we look at California's urban legend of the Dark Watchers. So I just came back from a week of camping in the Colorado Rockies, which is exciting because next week we're going to be looking at some stuff that I did on location there. We're going to be talking a little bit about a couple of different legends from Colorado, one of which is actually the true story of America's cannibal, Alfred Packer. And we'll be talking about him, or Colorado cannibal Alfred Packer. So we'll be talking about him specifically, and then we'll do another typical legend like this show normally does for the States. But I wanted to do this story because honestly, I came across the Dark Watchers a couple of years ago. I was doing some research for some books that I was writing, just looking for sort of these legends or supernatural entities that I might be able to use in the story. And I never really found a place to put them as of yet. I was drawn to this. There's something about this idea of when you're out in nature and truly exposed, and we were tent camping in Colorado, so that was something, it wasn't like we were out in the middle of nowhere. We were in a kind of a camping site, so there were people around, but still, not having solid walls between you and the creatures of the wilderness can be a bit unnerving. And so when you're hiking too, there's also this heightened sense of knowing that there are animals watching you that you can't see. Like you have no idea how many creatures, from teeny tiny little chipmunks all the way up to giant bears, that might be watching you, and you have no idea they're there. So that has always been something that gets me, is being stuck in nature or out in nature and not knowing exactly who it is that's watching you. And so when the Dark Watchers came across my path and I began to look into them, I thought this was an interesting legend, that obviously there's a quick dismissal, and we'll talk about that in a minute, of why it's not real, why they're not real. But what I found really interesting was that this is, though kind of a supernatural legend, it has been around for a long time. And we're not just talking about random individual people that are like, oh, this normal person. There have been famous people who have experienced the Dark Watchers, people that we know a lot about. So we're going to talk a little bit about those too. But really, this goes all the way back to the 1700s, when Spanish explorers first reached the region. And so what we find is that some people will say that there is I hope I'm not mispronouncing this, the Chumash people who lived there, the natives who lived in that region. Some people thought that the Dark Watchers came from them, but actually there's nothing really in their lore. There's no any indication that they ever had Dark Watchers. Getting some of this from Live Science, which great article on this, which looks at not only the legend side, but also on the scientific side of it. Highly recommend checking that out. But yeah, there's no real indication of those folks having that legend. So where we really can track this back to is Spanish explorers who began to look up into the mountains and saw what looked like tall men in big brimmed hats and long black cloaks watching them. And they called them Los Obscuros Vigilantes. I believe that is correct. I'm doing my Duolingo, and I feel pretty confident that I just did some decent Spanish there. But the point is that, these guys are terrifying to those who said it. Vigilantes es oscuros. That's correct. There we go. I had to look it up and make sure I was right on that. Which translates to the Dark Watchers. So the Spaniards were observing these things and seeing them and feeling not good about being watched. Now, depending upon your perspective on history, you probably don't have a positive opinion of Spaniards at that time, of the Spanish explorers. So you're probably like, good, let the Dark Watchers get them. But the point is that it tracks, like it's been there for a long time. So these settlers began to come in, and then aside from the Spaniards, you also had other Anglo-Americans who came into the region, and they began to notice it as well. So you're talking about where some might say, okay, well, the Spaniards were predominantly Catholic, and so they're going to be influenced by this particular idea of being watched, like angels or demons or whatever it is. But other people who came in from various cultures and different backgrounds, they all saw the same things. Now, that's the other thing that makes this legend very interesting, is that the description is not shifting like you see with other things. Like people see the same things. They describe them exactly the same way. So are they real? Like, are there these supernatural entities wandering around, many giants walking around up in the San Luis Mountains, up around Big Sur? Are they walking around out there watching people? And if you actually see them or interact with them, do you, like my fictional Nancy at the opening of this story, do you disappear? Because that's the legend. The legend is that if you pursue them, if you try to actually get close to them and understand them more, then you go bye-bye forever. Like you're just gone. Now, we do know, if you listen to our Alaskan Triangle podcast a few podcasts back, you know that one of my theories about the wilderness is that people disappear. Like, that just happens. That's natural. And sometimes we don't have answers for why they disappear. Why a experienced hiker is just gone and we never find them. And so we want answers. And so maybe we sometimes, when all rational explanation for why they have disappeared seems to have been gone, maybe we look to that supernatural. And so we want to blame something like the Alaskan Triangle, or in this case, the Dark Watchers. And so the Dark Watchers, might sometimes be seen as vigilante, like villain type things, but sometimes they also can be seen as protectors. And so I think that's what's also interesting is that depending upon your sort of approach to this story, these are either good guys watching out and protecting you, or they are dark forces trying to harm you. Uh, you know, I would imagine if I'm hiking in the St. Louis Mountains and it is getting dark and I see a giant 10-foot tall apparition, I'm going to lean towards bad guy and probably get out. I'm not going to, try to pursue him just because I like to live and I don't want that to cease. So when we dive into this, when we go into these other explorations and other ideas, one of the people that we come across that has claimed to have had an interaction with the Dark Watchers is a very famous writer that you all have probably heard of named John Steinbeck. So John Steinbeck actually wrote a story in 1938 called Flight, and this character is seeing Dark Watchers. So where does this come from? Well, Steinbeck grew up in the region. He lived there, and there's actually some indication. He has told the story on several occasions that his own mother would take food into the mountains to leave for the Dark Watchers as a sacrifice. Okay, so now Steinbeck, he's a writer. I'm a writer. I get that. Sometimes we embellish things. So maybe he's trying to sell a story here. I don't know. But the point is that he was not afraid to talk about Dark Watchers. And not only that, but apparently Steinbeck's son Thomas wrote a book about them later on with a painter. So this is a family thing. Like the Steinbecks believe that these things are real, that they're actually out there. Again, there have been other cases too. There have been other folks. There was another American writer who also observed this. He was a poet, and his name, I can't find that right at this moment, but this poet found them as well. So like you've seen people who see it, they report these things, they tell these stories. So the question is, are they real? And that is a very, very interesting question to answer because yes, they're real. There are Dark Watchers, but whether they are a supernatural entity or a trick of the mind, that is where we might see some disparities. So one, let's just assume that I have laid out this case for them being supernatural entities. If they are, what are they? Are they angels? Are they demons? Are they spirits? Are they ghosts? Or are they some other entity that maybe doesn't fit into any typical lore? I don't know. I mean, I'm leaning towards the idea of, my story had a person disappearing. I think that's fewer and farther between. I do think, despite me saying if I encountered one while hiking, I would run away. I don't think that they are necessarily a malevolent force. I think they're probably more benevolent, perhaps watching over hikers, protecting people, that kind of thing. That being said, I am more inclined to think that they are on the science side of things, something that is an optical illusion. And it actually has a name as well. So the idea of these folks, of these things, these creatures, is basically it's a trick of the light. So it is a case of, from a scientific perspective, this trick of the mind, this idea is something called pareidolia. 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 Okay. Now, what that basically means is a phenomenon where your brain basically fills things in. So there's an easier way to put this. In psychology, when I teach it, I talk about it as closure. So like it's a similar thing to when you look at the clouds and you're like, oh look, it's a pig, or it's a car, or it's a kid chasing a bike, or whatever you see in the clouds. Your brain is filling in gaps. So there is definitely an argument to be said that when people look up into the mountains, up at Big Sur, and they see these giant dark shapes moving around, their brain fills in the gaps and says, look, it's a man with a large brimmed hat wearing a black cloak watching me. Simple as that. Okay, so your brain fills in those gaps, and it's something that's similar. Like you make sense of what it is. Why does everybody see the same thing? Because it basically would work the same way. Now, then you add in sort of a sociological aspect to explain what these Dark Watchers are, and it's that if you've lived in the region, you've heard the stories, you've heard the descriptions, and so your brain goes, I see this dark shape. it's a Dark Watcher. And you begin to associate with that. So in a way, it's a form of mild mass hysteria as well, that you see what everybody else sees and what you expect them to see. Again, not as much fun as the idea of 10-foot tall dark entities monitoring the mountains of California, but I lean towards the scientific explanation on this one. Like, I think that this is a definite situation where we're all seeing the same thing. But on a base level, it does play, like, again, we talk about these urban legends having morals or having lessons to them. I think it does play to a true hiker mentality of, when you're out in the woods, be aware. Be aware of what's going on around you. And maybe don't get too close to things you don't fully understand. I think that's a great thing to do in the woods. Like my family and I, we were out and we'd gone up to a couple of lakes and we saw some moose. And as much as I would love to get up close and personal with a moose, I've learned that if you get too close to these animals, they will kill you. I've seen enough YouTube videos and, National Geographic warnings to tell me that moose do not like you to mess with them. It's kind of true with a lot of livestock out there in the real world, out there in the forests and the mountains of this world. Don't get too close. Don't run up and don't pet a buffalo. And whatever you do, teddy bears are cute and everything, but do not hug a grizzly. Like, it's a bad idea. So stay away from those things. At the same time, if you see a dark shape in the California mountains wearing a large brimmed hat and a long black cloak, steer clear. Just stay away. Might be a good idea. So that concludes this episode of Urban Legends Unmasked. I hope you've enjoyed our look at the California Dark Watchers. We'll be back next time with actually a special edition. So next time, we're going to be talking about a story that is real, without a doubt real. We're going to be talking about Alfred Packer, the Colorado cannibal, and we'll tell his story a little bit more in detail. If you watch this on YouTube, if you watch the video version of it, we'll actually have an on-site video of the town where this occurred, Lake City, Colorado. Obviously, it's not the same as it was back in the 1800s, but there's some things that are very, very similar. And so we're going to look at that. We'll have some video for that. So more than likely, the podcast version, this version, will be a lot different than what you will see on the YouTube. So if you've never like watched both of them or listened to the podcast and watched the YouTube, now might be the time to actually do both, because there will be some different things in the two things. So keeping that in mind, I'm looking forward to that. And then the week after that, we'll do a regular Colorado legend, much like the vein of the Dark Watchers here. So as usual, just want to do a quick plug. I've got a couple of books that are out there that are fitting in this. Sawyer Shepherd Chronicles is where I was originally going to try to fit the Dark Watchers, and it just never really worked out. There was too much other stuff going on. So great supernatural thriller series about a young hero who is facing off with his demons, literally. And then also we've got Kill Town, which is your straight up slasher sort of horror story. And then Beneath Brittle Bones is out now. Did really well. It spent about a weekend at the #1 new release in American horror. And so it's about a long dead occultist from the 1700s whose skeletal body rises, claims some victims, uses their body parts to rebuild their body, and then seeks vengeance on the descendants of those who took its life. So, I like it. I think it's a good creepy story. And we're on to more things. So, if you're interested in those things, check them all out on Amazon. Other than that, we will see you back next time for Urban Legends Unmasked with me, your host, Chad Lehrman. Thanks for listening and or watching.